Welcome, all you unfortunate souls who have found yourself on this corner of the internet. This is episode 23 or something of Man Puns and Jesus, a show where we pretty much just talk about whatever suits our fancy that week. Um, and my name is Josh Laborious. I'm one of the hosts of this here podcast. I'm a pastor out in Eastvale, California, at a church called Edgewater. And my scruffier looking colleague over there is Ben Olschlager, Pastor Ben Olschlager, Reverend Ben Olschlager, the esteemed, and he's a pastor out in Lake Orion, Michigan, at Good Shepherd Lutheran Church. Count
Josh
that as
gets an
my
A for
win
the
for the
day.
day. What are we talking
Yeah.
about today, Benjamin Olschlager?
Josh and I both find ourselves at interesting churches. Josh is at a church plant that's been around for, was it 10 or 20 years?
12 years.
12 years.
The average,
Um,
side note, why that's weird, the average life of a church band is like 4 years, at which point they're either like full on their own or they're done.
and they find themselves still in the process of trying to locate or build a building. Um, and I know you've got some leads and stuff, but that has become kind of a part of the church's identity. Here at Good Shepherd, I find myself at a church that has a great facility, but it was also built at a time when the church was much larger. And so now we're reckoning as a smaller congregation with how do we manage a facility that's probably larger than we need. Um, and the thing that kind of connects those two and is of interest to Josh and I today is budget and money. Um, we both find ourselves in congregations where a significant portion of the budget has to go towards facilities or potential future facilities. And we're just curious, and we want to talk about this today because we don't really have a strong opinion on this yet. I mean, we kind of probably have a strong opinion, but it's not a fleshed out opinion yet. But we want to know, we want to ponder today, what is a good use of our funds? And realistically, looking at our own congregations and other congregations that we know, does the church make money an idol? And the answer to that is probably yes. But how significant of an issue is that? Uh, Josh, just off the top of your head, where does that send your brain?
Okay, so I tend to think about things in a very kind of like a strategic planning kind of mindset. And at least the way I've been taught, the way I've been trained, you start with your mission, you start with your goal. So for your general church, what is the mission? Well, the mission is to do the ministry of the gospel. The mission is to make disciples and make disciples of all nations. Um, the mission is to connect people to uh, faith in Jesus Christ, who lived and died for them. So that's our mission. So whenever I'm faced with any question in how do we do this, why do we do this, et cetera, I'm gonna bring it back to how does it serve that. So when we ask, what is the church, what should the church's relationship with money be, where my head immediately goes is what does how do finances play into that mission? And immediately my head goes, there are financial realities of doing ministry, right? If you want a full-time pastor, you have to pay them enough to support themselves and their family, right? Like, just not gonna beat around the bush at all. The reality is I need to be able to pay rent. I need to be able to buy groceries. I need to be able to fill my car with gas. Right? So there's a fundamental reality that if you want someone doing full-time ministry, if you want someone who is spending their time thinking and planning and doing things that build disciples, um, you have to pay them, right? That just is what it is. And the second is the reality that you probably need a space, and space costs money. Whatever that, so like for Edgewater, right now that looks, we rent the multi-purpose room of a local elementary school once a week. You know, if we have a special event, we pick it up for some extra time, but that is not free. If you have a building, even if it's paid off, it is not free. You have to pay power, you have to pay gas, you have to pay water, you have to pay to keep it clean. Things don't last forever. You got to pay to replace the roof, you got to pay to fix this and that, right? Owning a building costs money. If you're renting a space, that costs, right? So when we say, what does the church need money for? You need money to pay for the people doing ministry professionally. And you need money for the building, right? And I this is something I want to hear your thoughts on, because as I'm talking, I've had more conversations than I'm accustomed to having recently about the pay of professional church workers, right? Because what I if you're of a more frugal mindset, maybe what you just heard from me is that you just need to pay them enough to survive. Which, you know, you could, right? But there is a reality that someone else, somewhere else, is going to be willing to pay appropriately, right? Because if you're in the LCMS, that means your pastor at least has a master's degree, right? And we live in a society where the more education you have, generally speaking, the more money you command, right? And whether that is right or not, there's a reality of that, and we live in a capitalistic society. So the reality is, if you want to have and retain good staff, and I'm talking your pastor, I'm talking your secretary, your director of music, your like whatever staff member, if you want to get and retain quality staff members, you have to pay them enough that someone else can't just swoop in and say, hey, I'm going to pay you like a reasonable industry standard, and it looks like a huge jump up. Right. Um, because, and I'm speaking to this reality, and this is informed by Bierman. If I get a call, right, and I am, for anyone at Edgewater panicking, I'm off limits for 3 years unless something really bad happens. But say I get a call, and say this new church, all ministry opportunities are equal, right? I can serve God just as well at this church as I can at that church. Which is not always going to be the case, right? There are some churches that call and it's like, that's not a match for my skills, that's not a match for my passions, whatever. But saying all things ministry are equal, if they're willing to pay me 30 grand more a year, there is a reality that I'm probably going to take that job. And like I said, I'm not saying it's right, I'm not saying it's wrong. We live in a capitalist economy. That's how it works. You want the best pastor you can get, and you want to keep him. At very least, you should be paying him appropriately. I'm not saying make him wealthy, right? None of us went into the ministry because we wanted to be rich, right? We wouldn't have picked this job. But the reality is, if every month I am like white knuckled gripping the table as I'm watching my budget to see whether or not we're going to make it. If another church comes along and says, "Hey, you're not going to be rich, but you're not going to have to worry about paying your bills. Like we'll take care of you well." Just saying. That's immediately, and you can talk about other things you do in ministry that require money, but I think fundamentally if you're going to strip it down, those are your two expenses. You have to cover your salaries, you have to cover your facilities.
I mean, at the very least, that's a fair place to start. Um, as I was thinking about a couple of things you said, one, it's worth noting not every guy in the or not every pastor in the LCMS has a master's degree, but a lot of our guys who don't, who have one of our certificate degrees, they get more education than a lot of people who get MDivs at or in other denominations. I think the LCMS, I saw a statistic about 5 years ago. The LCMS's like average education rate for its pastors is like the third or fourth highest in the United States. So in terms of people
I'm
with
actually
master's
shocked
degrees,
we're not the first.
yeah, we're not the first, but we're not far off. Um, I mean, it's Catholic priests, like I think that are the highest because they have to go through 8 years of
8 years of
seminary training.
school.
Yeah. So uh anyway, all of that is to say our education level that we require in the Synod is high. And the Synod doesn't necessarily expect churches to pay us like we would get paid if that master's degree was in business or something else, because there would be very few churches that could reasonably afford that and still do ministry. But a comp that I've seen a couple of times and I think is a helpful one is, are you paying your pastor like local school teachers get paid? Because we're in a similar industry. We're in an industry where it's fairly service oriented. School teachers do not get paid enough for what they do. But they do it because they love the job. Pastors oftentimes are in the same boat. Could we get paid more for the skill sets we have? Sure, but we're here because we love the job, not necessarily because of the pay. Josh, why are you smirking?
I'm smirking because you say uh we we could get paid more for our skill sets elsewhere. And it just makes me think, coming out of undergrad, I had a job out of undergrad for my skill set. I had a job offer for 6 figures coming out of undergrad. 6 figures, full benefits, and I get to go to every single hockey game the Nashville Predators play because it was running stats for them. Right. So there's a lot of truth to that. If I wanted to make money, I could leave this industry and be making money pretty quick because I'm good at math.
We're kind of anomalies. I have
Yeah,
a
we're
bachelor's
weirdos
degree.
in that
Yeah,
regard.
I have a bachelor's degree in civil engineering, and Josh has a degree in math. Um, so we're maybe not the most prototypical pastors in the LCMS, but still, like, it isn't about the money, but like think about comps in terms of other professions in the area that are more service oriented, and aren't people generally in it for the money. And then the other thing that I was kind of thinking about as you were talking was the two kind of necessities for ministry that you see. Um, I agree with you on those things being needs. But I think we so overemphasize those things as needs sometimes that those get priorities 1, 2, and then like all the way down to 20. So people are so scared about losing their pastor or so scared about losing their building that they skimp on other things that are perhaps more important. And where my head is going on that is specifically on like care and outreach kind of things. I kind of look at the church and the way that we use our money somewhat like an investment. If you ham fist your money, sure, you'll be financially stable, but your church really isn't going to do anything. If you put your money into things, you might see a return. No guarantee, but you might see a return on, people's lives being impacted through programs. You might see improvements in your neighborhood. You might see maybe a boost in people interested in the church. Yeah.
Right. I mean, this is a very like business way to look at it. And I'm not, in fact, I'm going to go as far to say that is not the best way to look at it.
That's fair. It's just in my head.
A business way to look at it is the reality. If you spend, say you spend $700 in outreach and you get one family to join the church with that $700 you spent and they tithe faithfully, you've recouped your money.
You literally see a monetary return. And I'm not even thinking about it in terms of monetary returns either. I'm just thinking of it in terms of like kingdom returns. Like if we sit on money and do nothing, think of the parable of the servants. The master gives the servants a certain number of talents and says, take care of these for when I come back. First one goes out, doubles his money. Second one goes out, doubles his money. Third one gets one talent, buries it in the ground, sits on it forever and does nothing with it. That's kind of my picture of the way that churches maybe should use their budgets. Is not like we want to put money out so that we'll get more money back, but we'll put money out because our return will be greater, whether it's monetary or something else. Right.
Yeah. And this is something I don't know if I've thought all the way through it. So I want to like preface it with that, but I think if the church, you should not be sitting with a huge sum in your bank account that's just sitting there. If you were to ask me what's kind of the right amount for a church to have sitting in like a savings account, I would say you want an emergency fund. So like just like Chris and I have as a family, we have some money that's sitting in a savings account, zero risk savings account, but also zero gain. And we have it sitting there so that if I was to lose my job or something terrible was to happen, we would be able to pay our bills for at least a couple months, enough time to recover. So I don't think it's unreasonable for a church to have that same attitude of, if something really bad happens, we want to have some money in the bank to handle that. Right. I'm okay with that. I understand having an emergency fund. I think that's probably like a good stewardship thing to do. However, you shouldn't just let money stack up and stack up and stack up, because that money could, and I think should be, doing ministry, right? And here's where I'm not sure if I actually want to say what I'm about to say. So I'm going to say it and maybe ask for forgiveness later. Is the idea of endowment funds. Mm-hmm. Right. For those of you who are unfamiliar, and I'm not super familiar, so I could understand this wrong. I mostly picked this up through context. An endowment fund is essentially just a ton of money sitting in an investment account somewhere. And essentially, the idea at some churches is you have this big endowment fund and you operate off the interest. So say you have $1 million in the stock market, and you average say 8% returns a year, right? You're making, oh shoot,
That's
you're making
80,000.
$80,000 a year in interest. And from that $1 million, you just pull the 80 grand out every year and you use that. Which I'm thinking, like, imagine the kind of ministry that $1 million could do. And it's the difference between like a circle the wagons mentality and let's go out and do ministry mentality. And I'm solidly on the side of let's go out and do ministry. So like I know an endowment thing is like something that kind of gets pushed in some places, but I'm not sure that's good stewardship of what we've been given.
Mm-hmm. I agree with you there. Um, I think like I think of it kind of like almost siege-esque. We're gonna get a little off the wall here. So as small churches begin to feel like they are dying or decaying, they will hole up in their keep, their sanctuary, their building, and they will start to ration resources. They will start to ration budgets. They will start to ration whatever endowment or savings fund they have left, and hold on to everything for dear life. And that's, according to the world, a reasonably financially sound thing to do. But that also like stifles a lot of your opportunities to do kingdom work.
Well, yeah, and you circle back, what is the mission we're pursuing?
Mm-hmm,
We're making disciples and we're doing gospel work.
mm-hmm. And in my head, all that says is, okay, you're just waiting to die, right? Because if you're in a siege and you're just holding up and like rationing resources, you're hoping that someone from outside is going to come save you, and otherwise you're waiting to die. And I think a lot of churches are just waiting to die. They don't invest in any sort of breakout strategy. They don't invest in any sort of way to see or realize a change that could bring life back into the church. Yeah, in some ways we need to be using budgets, especially in that kind of situation where you've got some sort of endowment or savings above and beyond like an emergency savings. That's got to go into breakout strategies, not trying not to die strategies.
Yeah, and I think that's, I don't know. I feel like when it comes to money, we're too concerned with the preservationist kind of, we want to keep what we have going as long as we can. And it's like, well, let's look to where God is working, not where he has worked in the past. So now maybe, and unless we have more on this, where is the biggest place churches waste money? Because there's the flip side of this, right? There are people who they sit in the church and they don't want to spend anything because they're like, oh, we want to pay our absolute like necessity bills as long as we can, and I hope that I die before we run out of that or whatever. Which I think we've covered at this point. That's not really a faithful attitude to have. Have confidence that God's going to take care of his church. Have some awareness that it might not look like you want it to look like, and go forth boldly, I guess. But I think there's the other side of people who spend money on like irresponsible or unwise things. And I think the thing that comes mind to first for me is gimmicks.
Mm,
Like people spend money on gimmicky stuff to try and almost like trick people into coming into the church. And it's like I have faith in the quote unquote product, right? So let's uh let's spend money on more meaningful things than these gimmicks. And I don't know if it's safe for me to think of an example, so I'm gonna throw it back to you.
I think my example is probably unnecessary upgrades. Um, I think that like the temptation is uh this thing is now older than whatever the equivalent new model is, and it's frustrating me. So let's get rid of it and get the new one. Um, I think in churches right now, like some of the big ones are displays. I mean, there can be some financially wise decisions for upgrading displays, like getting a big flat panel TV is uh, a lot cheaper than replacing like 2 or 3 projector bulbs. And it's going to last you longer. So
Yeah.
I mean, there's some wisdom to that, but like there's also a level at which you're overkilling it and you're not maybe financially stewarding things well. Um,
Well, and it's one of those things
sound,
you got to keep in mind. Like, who are you serving?
yeah.
Right? If you're trying to be on the cutting edge of technology, but the people in your community don't know how the internet works,
Yeah,
like
yeah,
that's probably not a great place to put your money, right?
yeah.
Um, in the same way, if you're in a college town, right, spending your money on something on radio ads is probably not the move
Hmm.
because no one's listening.
That's fair. One that's a current example here. I live stream my Bible studies, and I just do it with I've got the camera floating around here somewhere. Yeah, um, like $25-$30 camera that my wife and I got last year at the seminary, um, for the sake of class, like Zoom classes. Is it great? No. Does it do the job? Yeah. Could we do better? Certainly. Do we need to do better? I don't know. Because I'd much rather have people physically present in Bible study and able to engage in those conversations whenever and wherever they can, realizing that some of them are in Florida for the winter or up north during the summer, or um, some visiting family or whatever, and they want to tune in and they want to be able to participate or go back and watch later after work or whatever the circumstance might be. um, but is that enough of a priority to meet the needs of those people that we should drop a few $100s on a camera and a new computer and mics to make that space more available and
Right.
accessible?
Well, and then you have the question of do they care?
They probably do. I've gotten some complaints.
Oh, well, right. And just because something is cool doesn't mean you should spend money on it.
Mhm,
Um, so I think there's a balance to be struck, right? I
mhm.
don't sit on your dragon's hoard, but also don't just throw money around because you have it, right?
Yeah, it's it is definitely a delicate balancing act, and I don't I'm not going to sit here and diminish that fact. but I think it's a worthwhile conversation for us as pastors and churches in general to be engaging in. Is, are we using our money for the sake of self-preservation, or are we using our money for the sake of advancing the church of God?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I think,
Or self-comfort, not even just self-preservation, but self-comfort.
right. And I think all of this to say, these are all maybe conversations that are happening in the leadership teams of the church, right? But I think if you're listening to this and you're not part of one of those leadership teams, right? You're just kind of you show up, you're like you're involved with the church, but you're not in a leadership role, which is fine. You may ask, well, how does this apply to me? The first and foremost thing I would say is keep this in mind when you are giving. Um, you are not giving to support a specific program or to whatever. You're giving to God's church as an act of worship is actually what it is. Um, this is to say two things. The first is, just because the church is doing something you disagree with, I mean, communicate that with love and with kindness, but communicate that. But you don't say, I'm going to stop giving because they're doing this thing I don't like, right? That's not appropriate, right? Because you do not always know what's best for the church, right? You probably don't have the full picture, et cetera, et cetera. And the second thing is, and this drives me nuts, don't be manipulative with your giving, right? And the way I've seen people do this is they give, and they give to a specific fund that doesn't exist, so that the church then has to spend that money on that thing. So an example might be, maybe you don't like the carpet in the sanctuary, so you give to the new sanctuary carpet fund. There wasn't a new sanctuary carpet fund, and now there is. And the church has this money, but the only way they're allowed to spend it is if they're replacing the carpet, which kind of pushes to, and it's like, no, that's inappropriate. Like that's manipulating the church with your own goals and preferences in mind. And that grinds my gears.
I think, to me, there's also a difference between doing something like that, and this is an example from my home church. And Josh is currently walking his dog down the hallway to prevent her from destroying anything in his office, or prevent him from destroying anything in his office. My dog's female, so that's my mistake. Since I want Josh to hear this other point, what I want to emphasize from Josh's point there is, yeah, it's important to not be manipulative in your giving, but also there are other ways to communicate about finances other than talking to your leaders. Like within the LCMS, voters meetings are huge at most churches, and you have the ability to put say into how church funds are spent through voters meetings. But Josh, something I wanted to throw at you was kind of related to the manipulative giving thing, but maybe in a little bit different direction. I think there are times where it's maybe appropriate to encourage the church to do a little better in some regards. Like if you have a time of fellowship and the church coffee is literally undrinkable because it is so terrible, I don't think it's necessarily inappropriate to, like, if you're just absolutely sick of it, maybe buy a new coffee maker or pay the little bit of extra for the church to get some slightly nicer and drinkable coffee. But again, within reason. Like, you don't want to like spend all of the money that you are supposed to tithe on doing something like getting slightly better coffee for church, but at the same time, like, it's maybe not completely unreasonable to do some small things and stuff like that. I'm not saying that my church's coffee is undrinkable. Worth me throwing that out there.
Yeah, well, and this is something that Chris and I do. So Chris and I, the tithe from my salary goes directly to the church, right? It's set up on automatic giving. I get paid on the 15th and the 15th of the month and the last day of the month. So on the 16th of the month and the first day of the next month, 10% of what I earn, actually, well, a little more than 10% because I like round numbers. It just goes. But with Chris's income, 10% of that we set aside, and we set aside for those little things. And from where I sit, they're little things that I know could get approved, like they'd be approved expenses, right? But I don't want to have to fill out a reimbursement. I don't want to have to send in receipts. I don't want to have to deal with that. So I just get it, right? And an example is like the crosses for Palm Sunday, right? That's like a $15 expense on Amazon. I'm like, yes, they'd be approved. I don't feel like doing the receipts and the paperwork and whatever. So I'm just going to order them, and that comes out of the 10%. So I think you're right. I think that's appropriate. But even that, I wouldn't say it's manipulative, right? I see a need and I'm taking care of a need, right? And I'm not trying to force the church to spend money on anything. I'm helping the church out in that way. So no, I think you're right. I'm trying to think of like what is a more definitive line for people, because I'm sure, because there's one specific instance that's coming to mind for me that I'm not going to use because I don't know if any of the people involved with this situation listen to this podcast, because they would recognize the situation instantly. But you think that there's a need, and that's why you gave to the fund that doesn't exist. And it wasn't a need, it was a want. So I don't know that I can give you a clear cut line, except for to tell you to think pretty seriously about it.
I guess it in my mind, it kind of circles back to like, does this thing accomplish ministry goals? In the sake of getting slightly better coffee, it might, because if somebody shows up to your church and your coffee is undrinkable, and they like coffee, they might never come back. If they show up to your church and your coffee is like passable and the people are great, there's chance that they might come back. I'm hoping somebody never chooses a church completely based on its coffee quality, but like, that's a reality.
And if you're sitting here thinking, no way, that it is entirely possible. I have met people who go to a church for a stupider reason than that.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, you're in church, so I'm happy, right?
Yeah.
You're hearing the gospel on a regular basis. I don't really care what got you there. Mm-hmm. Well, I care a little bit. Anyway.
I know a church, or I know a family that switched churches because of the smell of the sanctuary. Like, it was an old sanctuary, constantly smelled like an old sanctuary, and they just couldn't handle it, so they left.
Yeah.
Anyway, Yeah, all of this is to say, like, are there ministry reasons for doing some things with money? Absolutely. But realistically, our money as churches, as Christians, should be going more towards like reinforcing our fellowship, reinforcing the body of Christ, and reaching out to the lost. And if that's where we're investing our time, our effort, our money, as individuals, as churches, I think we're going to see a lot bigger return on our investment than if we are being super conservative with it.
Yeah. Well, and I'm gonna be even a little bit more bold. I'm gonna say not just we'll see a return on our investment. That's we're being faithful with what we've been given.
Yeah, that's what the law says to do.
Right. So whether or not you agree with us, or I shouldn't say this. Whether or not you like what we're saying, the reality is this is what we are told to do. We are told to use our resources to build disciples and to reach the lost, right? That is the scriptural, and that's not just a church thing, that's period, right? You are to use your money as an individual to build disciples, to grow closer to Christ, and to reach the lost. And you say, well, what? Well, part of building disciples is taking care of them, right? If you are spending money on rent, as far as I'm concerned, that's part of building disciples, right? You're taking care of yourself and your family. You're showing people that you're living honestly because you're not stealing whatever. Like, I can go on this, right? We can draw this out, and ultimately, I think that's the qualifier. And this probably actually pairs nicely with our podcast from last week on hobbies, right? If you're spending money, it should ultimately be in that pursuit. Is it going to support your relationship with God? Is it going to build disciples? Is it reaching the lost? And if the answer is no to all those questions, you better really seriously consider if that's where you want to be spending your money. Mm-hmm. So, hot take. Maybe hot take, medium temperature take.
Medium temperature takeaway.
That was smooth.
Thank you. Because I think that's basically my takeaway is as churches, as individuals, like, we need to be constantly reassessing our budgets and asking ourselves, are we doing this out of a sense of self-preservation and comfort, or are we doing this out of a sense of
I think I lost Ben. I'm almost certain I lost Ben. So I'm going to go with my takeaway, ladies and gentlemen.
I might also be frozen.
Oh, now you're back. Now Ben's back.
Did you hear any of that?
No.
Okay. My takeaway is basically, if we need to be observing whether things are out of a sense of self perseverance or preservation and comfort, or if they're out of a sense of service and ministry. If you like your budget, you might need to change it, because if you like your budget, it's probably going to suit you and not necessarily suit the kingdom.
And I think my takeaway is going to be kind of that last point. Always think about what ultimately you are pursuing with your spending of money, right? Because how you spend your money, it's communicating something about your priorities, whether you like it or not. And that isn't to say, you should be giving all your money to church, but the reality is how you spend your money should be in line with your beliefs, in line with the faith we share. And if it's not, you probably need to revisit that. So, prayer requests for the day. Pray that God gives you a clear head to think about this kind of stuff. Grace when you don't.
And for sound discernment on the decisions you make with the money you have.
Yeah, there we go. That's all she wrote. Go in peace, serve the Lord.
Thanks be to God.